Well, good morning. Back to Isaiah, and we're going to finish off chapter 42. So let's read it. Hear, you deaf, look, you blind, and see. Who is blind but my servant, and deaf like the messenger I send? Who is blind like the one in covenant with me, blind like the servant of the Lord? You have seen many things, but you pay no attention. Your eyes are open, but you don't listen. It pleased the Lord for the sake of his righteousness to make his law great and glorious. But this is a people plundered and looted, all of them trapped in pits or hidden away in prisons. They have become plunder with no one to rescue them. They've been made loot and with no one to say, send them back. Which of you will listen to this or pay close attention in time to come? Who handed Jacob over to become loot and Israel to the plunderers? Was it not the Lord, against whom we have sinned? For they would not follow his ways, they did not obey his law. So he poured out on them his burning anger, the violence of war. It enveloped them in flames, but they did not understand. It consumed them, but they did not take it to heart. Contrast this with the opening of this chapter, where it talks about my servant in whom I delight. And then we got here, who is blind like my servant. And it's a kind of diatribe against his servant. I think I mentioned at the beginning that this is the first servant songs. And sometimes it's difficult. Well, there's arguments about, is it referring to Jesus? Is it referring to Israel? Is it referring to the church or whatever? And in a sense, the answer is yes. Some of the servant songs quite clearly apply to Jesus. This bit obviously doesn't. Jesus was not blind. Jesus loved his Father and obeyed his Father and trusted his Father perfectly. What we see, and then we get this, and this clearly refers to Israel and their disobedience against God. So what are we to make of all this? Well, it's all about God's plan of salvation. You see, man, we have become what we have become because we sinned against God. Israel is kind of a microcosm of what's happened, of the results of sin. I mean, if you think about it, the Old Testament can be looked at as a record of the sins of Israel. It does not build Israel up. It doesn't paint a pretty picture of Israel. But it's showing what we are all like. But then we get Jesus, the servant, who is the perfect servant. We get this servant, these so-called servant songs in Isaiah, which paint the picture of this perfect servant achieving great things, sometimes through suffering. Isaiah 53 being the primary example of that. But we get this perfect servant and we get this absolute disastrous servant. What are we to make of it? Jesus shows us what we should be like. He shows us what mankind is meant to be like when mankind is living in proper relationship with God. Living by faith, living by love of God, living by trust in God. And it also shows us what we will become, what we are becoming. Not just what we are meant to be like, but what God is making us like, making us more and more Christ-like. You all know Romans 8:28. God works through all things for the good of those who love him. Fewer people know 8:29, which talks about us being conformed to the likeness of Christ. This is what God is doing. He is working in our lives to make us more and more Christ-like. That's what God's up to. If you wonder what God's up to, what on earth is he doing? He is working to make you and me more and more like Jesus. Amen.